This is a story that began in 1961 and continues until this day. So far, it has encompassed 4 generations of our family over a period of 55 years. It is perhaps an unusual story with an even more unusual beginning. One day in 1961, my mother was paying some money into our local bank at Exmouth, and while she was doing that, the cashier behind the counter asked her a question, quite out of the blue, which would change our lives far more than we could ever have imagined. What he said to her was, "Do you know a farming family who would take a Norwegian farmer's son to work on the farm for the summer so that he can learn some English?" My mother immediately said, "Yes, we will take him," without asking any other members of the family, and that is where our part of the story begins. However, the story really began in the middle of the North Sea, when 2 absolute strangers met each other on board a ferry. The rest, as they say, is history. And 55 years later, it is still continuing in this area of Norway, either side of the 1994 Winter Olympic town of Lillehammer. The bank clerk from Exmouth was called John Horder, and we had known him for many years. Prior to asking my mother the question, John had been on a cycling tour of southern Norway, and on the way over on the ferry from England, he had met a young Norwegian girl called Anna-Lena Harnum, who lived near the town of Hamar. John was always a little eccentric, and I think he must have been to want to go cycling in Norway in the 1960s, when most of the roads were still dirt roads, but he and Anna-Lena got on well. When the ferry docked at Oslo, Anna-Lena, then only a teenager, was collected by her farmer father Anders, who had driven down from Hamar especially to pick her up. Later in the day, while driving back up the E6, the main spine road of Norway, the car passed John Horder struggling on with his bicycle. Recognised by Anna-Lena, they stopped and offered him a lift as far as Hamar, and it was while they were chatting en route the question was put to him regarding a son coming to England to work on a farm. John said he would ask around when he returned home, and that is what he did. Luckily for our family, my mother was first in the line. Johan Harnum was the first son to come to us in the summer of 1962, and he was with us for about a month. I was scheduled to go over there the following spring and work on their farm for a while. At this point, I was only about 19 years old. Johan's brother Olaf came to us the following summer, and since then various cousins and friends have been to Woodbury over the years. The 2 boys also had 2 sisters, Sidsel, seen here with her father in 1968 as a young teenager, and again in 2010, by which time she had become one of Norway's top potters. The other daughter was of course Anna-Lena, the girl from the ferry. The Harnham farm was much smaller than ours in England, and very different. The typical Norwegian cowhouse contained 20 to 30 cows, which were kept in all the time and fed zero grazed grass in the summer and silage during the long cold winters. I soon found out that Norwegian farm barns were designed extremely well to be able to accommodate the cows on one level, with the muck going down into the cellar below, and the hay and silage stored above to drop down to be fed to the cows. This I considered to be highly efficient. The farm also had a large housed poultry department producing eggs within the same building, and this was basically run by Ragnhild as her income. So in March of the following year, I took my first visit to Norway. I remember arriving at Oslo Airport on a BOAC Comet aircraft landing on a very icy runway. On touching down, reversed thrust was given to the engines, which made everybody on board gasp, as it was not long after a comet had crashed in the Mediterranean and the passengers were still a little apprehensive. The train was taken to Hamar, where I was met by Anders and Johan. It was at this point that I found out that I was not now in England, and everyone here didn't speak English very well. However, I soon learned that having a common interest in particular, reasonable communications could take place by using our joint imaginations and gestures. Most of the snow had gone from around the farm, but there was still plenty up at Shoesherne, a mountain area where they had a cabin. Of course, I'd never seen so much snow in my life before, as at home it only lasts a couple of days. In Norway it was very different, and took a little getting used to say the least. I was put to work in the potato shed, where I had to help grade the potatoes into different sizes, at a temperature well below freezing, and this soon hardened me up quite quickly. But the break for coffee was always eagerly looked forward to. In the evenings, Anders would tell stories of what it was like around Hamar during the wartime, and how they used to hide a radio deep inside a heap of potatoes, so that it wouldn't be found by the Germans if they came. The Norwegians, of course, are excellent skiers, and have been brought up almost from birth to be able to ski. The morning after they arrived at the cabin, they decided they would take me on a 20-kilometre round trip to a village called Hornsjö and back, to see if I was up to it. I'd only previously skied once before, on a trip to Switzerland when I was at school, but I soon remembered what I had to do. We set off early in the morning after breakfast and followed in the ski tracks, which made life a bit easier. They really didn't think I would make it, but I showed them that a young man from England could compete with the Vikings at their own game. We stopped at Hornsjö for coffee and then headed back again in time for supper. I have to admit that I couldn't walk for a couple of days after, as my legs were so stiff. However, after getting my energy back, I spent many an hour skiing in the beautiful area around the cabin. With this visit to Norway almost over, we returned back to the farm, and 2 days later I was back on a train to Oslo and heading home. This I thought might be the only visit I would ever make to the country that I now had developed a great affection for. How wrong I was to be. After getting married in 1964, we had a bit of a lull in our visits, but when our first child came along in '65, we had a request from a cousin of the Harnums if she could come and stay with us to also learn English. This young lady came from Lillehammer, which was a town another 90 kilometres further up the E6, and she was called Liv. She came over to England with her friend Berit, whose father was a shopkeeper in Lillehammer. Berit, however, went to be with some people in London. In the end, she didn't like London and came down to Woodbury to stay with Liv and us. Liv came at a convenient time, and although she was not an au pair, she spent a lot of time looking after our new baby boy called Simon and pushing him around in his pram. Little did we know at the time that 55 years later we would still be meeting Liv almost every year. We have been good and solid friends ever since our first encounter. Following the initial visit of Liv, we returned to Lillehammer to stay with her parents at their house in the centre of the town. From here it was possible to ski from the front door if you wanted, but the family also had a cabin at Shoesherne, right opposite their cousins Anders and Ragnhild. We spent some time there over 2 winters, and I remember having to slide down a snow-covered slope to get to the cabin, as during the winter it had no direct access from the road due to the deep snow. Once inside the door, I found it was very cold, as no heating is left on when the cabins are empty, but there was always a good supply of logs, and when the big black stove in the corner was lit, the whole place warmed up in about half an hour. Water was the next problem, as there was no running water to the cabin then, and all water had to be brought in a churn from a hydrant about 100 metres away. And guess whose job it was to do that? Back in the late 60s and early 70s, none of the cabins had an inside toilet either, so if you needed to go during the night, you had to dress up warm, put your boots on and trudge out through the snow in your pyjamas in freezing temperatures. When you got there and opened the lid, an awful smell came out. When you sat on the seat, you almost stuck to it as it was so cold. To an Englishman, this was a little harsh. Following the unqualified success of our Norwegian liaison, many more reciprocal trips followed in the years to come. Not only did we go on more trips there, but the senior members of the various families also spent time with each other. My father and mother first went to stay with Anders and Ragnhild at Arnhem, and later with Liv's parents in Lillehammer. In fact, my father and mother made many trips during the 1970s, before my mother died in 1978. In 1974, because I had been awarded a Nuffield farming scholarship to study pigs in Eastern Europe, we had purchased a motor caravan to go on the trip with. Having successfully completed that, in 1976 we decided that perhaps a trip to Norway would be a good idea. So we set off from Harwich to the Hook of Holland by ferry with 2 small children, and drove up through Holland, Germany, Denmark, and up the coast of Sweden to stay first with Anders and Ragnhild at Hamar. We ventured further up from there and toured around the Jotunheimen, a high mountain area, wild camping at night in the wilderness of Norway. On the tops of the mountain areas there was still some snow in places, and we used to put our ice packs in the snow at night to keep them frozen. We also witnessed the pollution from mainland Europe, we were told, which gave the snow pink and blue hues in places. On the way back we came down through the Gudbrandsdal Valley, which is rated as one of the most beautiful in Norway. Passing Ringebu Church on the way, which is one of the finest examples of old churches in Norway and of tremendous historic importance. It was built circa 1220 AD. We stopped for a night at Magali camping near the village of Tretton. This particular area we really fell in love with and always said that we would return one day. Once again, at the time this was just a dream, little knowing then what was likely to happen 27 years later. Further down the road we stayed again with Anders and Ragnhild on the farm, and as it was summertime, a barbecue was laid on for us. We then drove across southern Norway to Bergen, where we took the ferry back to Newcastle. Many visits to Norway took place during the following years, both by us and my parents, but in 1994 we decided to go to the Winter Olympics, known as OL 94, which was held in Lillehammer. Everything for this was booked through an agency in England, and we had no idea where we would be staying, except that it would be with a family in Lillehammer. This was to be the start of yet another adventure for us, as we had only been told their name and that they would meet us at Lillehammer station from the train. Their names were Taya and Alma Mo. Taya had just retired from being the headmaster of a local school, and Alma was an expert at handicrafts of many kinds. Both were extremely practical, to say the least, and very friendly. Having told Taya that I would be arriving at the train station wearing a yellow-coloured anorak for easy recognition, we didn't realise that half the world would be arriving also wearing yellow coats. This caused some initial problems of recognition, but eventually when all the other coats had gone, we were the only ones left, and Tyre came up to us and said, "You must be Roger and Vera, I presume." With our bags bundled into the car, he took us on a slippery drive up to his house, where we were then welcomed by his wife Alma. Little did we know then that this would be the start of another great family friendship, which was last for years to come. Both of them treated us far better than just the paying guests that we were, and in true Norwegian fashion, welcomed us fully into their family structure. We met their daughter Birgitta and her husband Tore Fossum, who had a small farm in the neighbouring village. So we had something in common with them, and of course they spoke good English, which was a bonus to us. Birgitta and Tore were part of a country dancing display at Hafjell during the games, and a short video clip follows. During this period we met up again with Anna-Lena and her husband Jarle. We had not seen her for many years, maybe only once since her visit to Woodbury in the 1960s, as she had moved away to make her home in Stavanger on the other side of Norway, where her husband had his job. During the course of the fortnight, the man in the yellow coat also made some other new friends. The main symbol of OL 94 was the Fackelman, and he was cut into the hillside at Hafjell, where the slalom skiing took place. It made a very striking symbol, which was televised throughout the world. A closer look shows how cleverly this was done. However, during the ensuing years it has been necessary for him to have a regular haircut, as the removal of the trees let the light in and the undergrowth started to grow. Here you can see that he is looking a bit spotty and in need of a trim. In the summer he can't be seen at all, as he is all green. During OL, the main street of Lillehammer was a throng of people of all nationalities. I managed to take a bit more video here, which shows what was going on. The whole Games was a very musical event, but the temperature never rose above minus 25 degrees for the whole fortnight. 4 years later, in 1998, we decided to take a summer tour from England to the North Cape with our own car from home. To do this, we first had to drive to Newcastle, some 8 hours drive from Woodbury, to take the ferry across to Bergen. On leaving Bergen, we travelled through Voss and cross-country, following the road between Sonyafell and the Jotunheimen, which we had travelled in 1976 with a motor caravan. Stopping just north of Otta for the night, we headed on again the next day, where we stayed for the second night. On again up the E6, we arrived at a lovely caravan park just a few kilometres below the Arctic Circle, where we took a cabin to break the journey. There were still 3 more days of driving ahead before we would be able to reach the North Cape, or Nordkapp as it's known in Norway. We finally arrived in the town of Honningsvåg in the early afternoon in a torrential rainstorm and drove on to find somewhere to stay. Unfortunately, we had not picked the best of evenings to go there, as the cloud cover was almost 100%. But after a long wait, with hundreds of other people of all nationalities, a gap appeared in the clouds, which let us glimpse the sun. We drove back to our hotel without any lights on the car at 2 a.m. in the morning. We had never witnessed 24-hour daylight before, and it was quite incredible. We went up again during the next day to take a better look at the surrounding area, and saw many reindeer in the wild, plus snow in some of the hollows which had not melted since the last winter. It is indeed a bleak place at any time of year. It took us another week to return as far as Lillehammer, back down the same E6, as there is no alternative. Here, 30 kilometres above Lillehammer, we stayed once again at Magali Camping, where we had stayed previously 22 years before. We occupied one of their timber cabins for a couple of days, so that we could visit our locally based Norwegian friends in and around Lillehammer. We became quite friendly with Tor Magali, the owner of the park, and returned by air for several of the following years. We would tell Tor that we would be a little late arriving, and he would leave the cabin key in a place that we could find it to let ourselves in. On one of our subsequent visits to Magali, we started looking in the windows of estate agents to see if there were any cabins that we could buy in the area, and to get an idea of sizes and prices. Eventually, when sat at home using my computer one evening and surfing the agents' websites, I came across 1 or 2 potential properties which looked interesting. However, they were all a bit run down and would need some work done on them. Just at this point of time, I had a life assurance policy come to maturity, and decided that rather than just put the money in the bank and get miserable interest, I would take control of the money myself and launch out and take a chance, and hopefully have a bit of fun and make some money in the process. It was a calculated risk. During our next visit, we went to look at those that we had on the short list, and eventually decided that only one might be a possible contender, aptly called Lickabo, translated into English meaning lucky house. To us this seemed to be our own stroke of luck, and after viewing it from the outside, decided to pursue it further. The price was still a little too high in view of some of the work which would have to be done on it. We returned to England still pondering what to do, but had fallen in love with it. Many negotiations took place via fax and email to the agents, and a price was eventually agreed with the sellers, and they would also do some of the repairs required before we took it over. However, before anything could be finalised, we found out that I would have to get a D number, that is a Norwegian national insurance number, before any deal could be transacted. The view out of the front window across the lake was out of the world for an Englishman, and you could even still see Magali Camping in the distance. Eventually, on the 5th of August 2003, it became ours, and my long-term dream of having a cabin in Norway had at last become a reality. We were now the proud owners of 800 square metres of this wonderful country. The previous owners, whose family had built it, came to hand over the keys and show us how to operate the things inside. This is customary in Norway. We were extremely lucky that they had left virtually everything inside the cabin for us, so we were able to move in without having to go out and furnish it or buy anything. However, the next morning we woke up and wondered just what we had done, and if it had been the right move. From our early days of the 1970s cabins, this old cabin was a luxury, as it had both a toilet inside, water to the cabin through a pipe from a well across the road, and mains electricity. It even had an electric water pump. No more plodding out in the night in freezing conditions or fetching water. In the winter we would find out that the lake would freeze over, and the local police would set out a driving course where they would train youngsters in the art of driving on slippery roads. A closer look shows all these vehicles parked in the centre of the lake on just 4 inches of ice. The next day we introduced ourselves to Ola and Lisbeth, who were our neighbours and lived in the small farm about 100 metres away. We had met Ola briefly before when we came to view the cabin a few months earlier. We seemed to get on quite well at this meeting and soon realised that we would have to depend quite a lot on both of them for local information, such as where to get different things, etc. Over the following years, our friendship strengthened, and Ola has now visited us twice in England. When we bought the cabin, it was painted a very faded blue-green colour, which certainly needed refreshing. We didn't really like the colour anyway, so looked at various other local properties to see what would be the best colour to repaint it. House colours in Norway are fairly basic: red, yellow, blue, green, or black or white. We decided to go for the Gammel Rødt, Old Red, which seemed to be the predominant colour in the area. It took 4 days of hard work by both of us to paint all round with the red, one side each day. Then some white had to be applied to the windows, which was a little more difficult, as the timber was very narrow surrounding the glass. In the end, however, we considered we had improved the look of the place considerably, and all the hard work had been worth it. When we bought the cabin, there was one thing missing, and that was a patio. The door to it from the cabin had been built into the original design, but the patio had never been constructed. The door itself was some 60 centimetres above outside ground level and wasn't used for this reason. It was on this visit that I decided something needed to be done about it. I measured up and drew a plan and consulted Ola about the size of the timbers necessary to take the winter snow load, with a view that on our next visit in July I would construct it myself. So both of us returned on the 23rd of June, geared up with all the tools that were required to build a patio. A heavy-duty electric drill to make the fixing holes in the concrete base, hammers, spanners, bolts and all. Our suitcases were very heavy. The next morning I went down to the builders' merchants at Tretton and ordered up all the timber that would be needed, and the following day it was delivered by lorry. First we had to fix some boards to the base wall of the cabin and get them level. This was obviously very important. Ola would come and inspect at various intervals to see if I was doing the job correctly. I don't think he was sure that an Englishman he had not known for very long could undertake such a project. However, all the way through, his advice was taken on board by me and was very useful. By the 3rd of July, the floorboards were laid in place, and Ola was consulted about how wide the gap should be between the boards. "Not so wide that your money falls down between," he said. After working out a good average, over 1,000 screws were used to fix them down. It was good then, as we could now sit outside in the fresh air and sun and have a cup of coffee, and the patio door was used for the first time. The other advantage was that it gave us an awful lot more room to move about, which was great. After the floor was fixed, a boundary fence was erected around, and some steps down to the front. With the small amount of timber that was left over, I made a table, which has been very useful throughout all our time there. Despite the fact that it might seem that we were working all the time, we did have a few days off, and on one Saturday in July met up with Taya and Alma Mo, who with their daughter Birgitta and husband Tora took us to their setter up over the top of the hill opposite. This was a most amazing experience, as previously setters were things we only learnt about when we were at school in England. Everything was explained to us as to how the system worked, and that virtually every local farm had its own setter, where the farm animals would go for their summer holidays for a couple of months. Whilst there, we saw moose in the distance and reindeer on the way back. One evening we went on an organised walk with the Tretton History Society. This was most interesting, and on the way we were told about the wartime exploits that had happened there with the English soldiers. Luckily, a lady we had previously met came along and acted as interpreter, which really made the evening go well. There is a lot of history around the hillsides of Tretton. Many of our summer evenings have been taken up with walking around the local area, where there are many different walk paths that can be taken and a lot of old buildings to be seen. Compared with Woodbury, everywhere in Norway, away from the main roads, is so very quiet and peaceful. During our walk with the History Society, we were chatting to our interpreter lady about how we came to be so fond of Norway, and she said that her daughter Camilla was a reporter with the local newspaper, and that our story would make an interesting article for her. Would we be willing to talk to her? At the time, the paper was doing a weekly series on people's idea of paradise. Perhaps rather foolishly, we said yes. At 7:30 a.m. next morning, there was a knock on the cabin door, and Ola was there in his pyjamas, holding a mobile phone in his hand, saying that he had a reporter on the line, and would it be okay if she came in half an hour to interview us. She duly arrived, complete with a photographer, and on the 13th of July we had a 2-page spread in the local paper, much to our surprise. One thing which is different from at home is the fact that many of the farm animals that roam the forest in the summer are fitted with a bell so that they can be located. This gives lovely background music to the whole area and is far better than the motor cars we get at home. If something should startle the animals, they all rush up the field and all the bells ring together, making it very musical. The cows too have bells, which ding every time they take a bite at the grass. When we bought the cabin, there were still one or two unfinished matters inside. The fireplace had no stone top to it, and the electric water pump positioned beside the fireplace had no door to it. These had been bugging us for some time, so finding that there was a stone factory in Tretton, we went to see them to see what might be possible. With the measurements supplied by us, they cut out a top and we took it back in the rear of the car. It was quite long and weighed 55 kilograms, so Ola's help was required to get it into place. Whilst talking to the man at the stone factory, I asked him if he had ever been to England, and he said that his daughter had recently been at a language school at Sidmouth, so what a small world it is. That finished the fireplace to satisfaction, and I found an old door in the woodshed, which I cut down to size to fit the size of the opening in front of the pump. When fixed in place, the whole fireplace looked much better, and the pump was a lot quieter when operating. We noticed one winter that when the snow had slipped off the roof, it had bent the guttering, and that had to be repaired before we came home again. Our friend Leave had told us before that if you have a cabin, there was always something to do. However, this was not a problem for us, as we always liked to be doing something, but found it was always better to do it in the summer when it was warmer. When we bought the cabin, it came with a shed full of logs. It soon became apparent that the shed was becoming empty, and some thought had to be given as to where we could get some more. Ola was consulted, and he talked to a neighbouring farmer who owned the forest area behind us. This farmer kindly said that we could go into his forest and cut up any trees that had fallen down, of which there were many. So armed with a chainsaw supplied by Ola, I set off into the woods to see what I could do. This was not an easy task, as most Norwegian forests are not on level ground, but on a slope of at least 45 degrees or more. This made standing up safely with a chainsaw in your hands very difficult. The larger ones had to be split with the aid of an axe into 4 or 6 pieces so they would fit into the stove. I can quite see why logs cost so much to buy, as there was a lot of work involved, which is not appreciated at first glance. However, always worth it, as the shed had now been filled up again. This is a process that has been undertaken every year since then. During our travels in Norway, we had always noticed that most dwellings had a flagpole, where the national flag would be raised on special days, or at half-mast for a death in the family. Not wishing that we were going to die, I asked Ola, where could I get a flagpole? Leave it to me, he said. I will find something by the next time you come. On arriving back in May of that year, 2 trees were lined up by Ola's saw bench. Which one would you like, he asked. I said, I will have that one, that is the straightest, pointing to the best of them. He then said I would have to remove the bark so that the tree could dry out, and that I must not paint it for 12 months. Using a spoke shave that he loaned me, I spent the next hour or 2 removing bark. Now I had to think about where I was going to erect the flagpole. Eventually I found a place which I thought would be suitable by doing a bit of prodding of the ground. Unfortunately, most Norwegian ground has a large underground content of rock, which is not always visible, through which it's impossible to dig. Thinking that my chosen spot was okay, I started to dig with my iron bar and shovel, and I was lucky. I went down a metre without a problem. Found some pieces of 6x2 which had been left over from the patio construction, and inserted them into the hole to make a swivel base for the eventual pole. In the end, all was finished, and the Devon flag was raised to show that the Viking invaders had arrived. The pulley wheel on the top and the rope to pull the flag up came from Cyril's shop in Woodbury. During the winter, almost every tractor in Norway is permanently equipped with a snowblower so that they can get in and out, and each farmer usually has a section of country road to keep clear as well, on contract from the local authority. These roads have to be driven with care, as sometimes if you pull in too close to the side, you are liable to finish up in a ditch, as I did on one occasion. Our cabin had a sealed tank for the toilet effluent, and when full it had to be emptied, winter or summer. However, it would usually last for a year at a time. In winter, if the temperature rises a little, icicles can appear in front of the window, and ones like these could form within a couple of hours. There is a severe danger when things begin to thaw, as the snow on the roof begins to slide off. Snow retaining bars can be fixed to the roofs to help stop this, but the roar when it does come off sounds like an avalanche. However, on the other side of the spectrum, if your house catches fire, the heat can be enormous, and as they're all constructed with timber, there is no chance of putting it out. The Devon flag proved to be most useful on a number of occasions, not least in Lillehammer at the ski jump hill. For several years we attended the World Cup ski jumping competitions there in March of each year, and as everyone else had a flag to wave, thought we should have one as well. We tied it to our walking pole and waved it in the air like the others, each time a popular jumper came over the knoll. This caused some consternation with the people beside us, and we kept getting a pat on the shoulder with the question, "Where are you from?" because they didn't recognise the flag. When we told them we were from a county in England and this was its flag, they were all very happy, and long conversations took place. On one occasion we were sitting with a busload who had come up from Hamar. It was a good job that they had come by bus, as I don't think they would have been fit enough to drive home when the jumping had finished. They came equipped with all the goodies to have a good party, and a good party they had, including fancy dress. They included us in their fun and games and plied us with aquavit, vodka, rum, moose sausage cut off with a pocket knife, and smoked salmon. The friendliness that Norwegian people have to total strangers has always amazed us. Luckily our car had a sat-nav and could find its own way home. In February 2006, our son Simon, the one who was the baby in the earlier picture, and his wife Nicola and their three boys, Ben, Tom and Wills, came with us. This was to be the boys' first attempt at skiing, and they were very keen to try it. Like our daughter Helen previously, they also went to ski and had several days of lessons, and by the end of the week had become very proficient. This is Ski Campen, and it's a wonderful place for the family, as it is well equipped with lifts and a good area for cross-country skiing for all the family. During the summer periods we have to tend the garden a bit. There is a small area of grassy lawn which has to be cut with a rotary mower, which we inherited with a cabin. The rest of the garden is what is called in Norway natural. This means it is undulating ground with only natural wild flowers, plants and trees growing on it. There are so many different wild flowers compared with England, so that in the summer time the garden is a mass of colour, like a carpet. Wild strawberries abound as well, but luckily all of this area needs very little attention, and the weight of the winter's snows breaks off the previous year's growth, which starts again when the snow disappears the following spring. In Norway, many of the farm animals stray from their setters and roam loose in the forests during the summer period, and it was not uncommon to see them walking on the roads and paths. Occasionally they would stray into the area around our cabin and had to be enticed out by one means or another, usually a bucket with some cow or sheep nuts in. But this is just part of Norwegian daily life in the country areas. We have seen moose nearby and have been told that brown bears may pass this way sometimes. If you're sitting in your cabin and hear a knock on the door, it's wise to look out of the window first to see who it is, as it might be a hungry bear. National Day on the 17th of May has always been a very important day for the people of Norway, and we have been there on several occasions during the May period. Tretton, our nearest village, always puts on a good show of music and singing. We have been to Lillehammer also on the 17th, and the procession there is enormous, with many bands playing and students marching. It's customary on National Day for all Norwegians to wear their national costumes, and these are usually very old and have been handed down from one generation to another and are family heirlooms. They are also extremely finely embroidered and colourful, and if you wanted to buy one, it would cost you well in excess of £1,000. Not all the traffic in this period has been one way to Norway. In 1997, Tyre and Alma came to stay with us in England, and we showed them around our area as they had done for us in the Gudbrandsdalen. They found it very different in many ways to life at home. We drive on the wrong side of the road for a start and eat very different food to what they were used to. But they joined in the fun, as we did when we visited them. We took them to Land's End, where they had their photograph taken for their holiday pictures. In 2008, Ola also came back with us to England for a week. I had told him that on the way he would see more cars in half an hour than he had seen at Tretton during his lifetime. He was really very shocked to see so many cars on the motorways around London. But on the way to our house, we stopped off at Stonehenge, as it was somewhere he had always wanted to go. He came again to us in 2010 to help celebrate Vera's 70th birthday. As he's a member of the Tretton choir, he came prepared to sing 2 of his local songs during the party evening, which really impressed the other guests. He is a good singer with a fine voice. Probably our worst experience was when we took a 4-day trip further north and away from the cabin to stay at a hotel in Geiranger for a few nights. We had taken the car down the fjord on the car ferry to the other end, with the intention of driving back over the high ground to see some of the summer snow and skiing. This is where the ski athletes practice in the summertime. This was something like a 150-kilometre round trip. All went well. We saw the snow and the skiers and proceeded on to get back to our hotel in Geiranger for supper time. We needed to stop to fill the car up with diesel at the very small filling station there, which was a bit crowded, and the front wheel of the car accidentally just caught the concrete base of the pump. A hissing noise was heard, and when we looked, the tyre was flat, and on inspection actually split. Thinking I could change the wheel to put the spare on looking in the back, I found that there was no spare. This I could not believe. We were only 2 kilometres from the hotel, but eventually had to go 120 kilometres to get there. It was 5 p.m. on a Saturday evening, the worst time to have any sort of problem. There was no tyre supplier in the village, so I phoned the hire company's rescue service. The nearest rescue lorry was 100 kilometres away, and he was already out on another job. We would have to wait. We waited and waited for 3 hours, and eventually help arrived. "Can't do anything here," said the driver. You will have to come with me." So we were loaded up onto his lorry and taken back to his workplace, where a new tyre could be fitted. We were both squeezed into the cab with the driver and were taken at high speed through many tunnels and around many bends to arrive at his workshop about an hour later. The driver luckily was very jovial, and he gave us a commentary on the countryside that we were passing through all the way back, and we told him about our life in England. The tyre was fixed, but we still had to drive ourselves the 100 kilometres back to Geiranger, a journey we had already done in the afternoon, where we unfortunately were too late for our supper. It was what we call a bad day all round, but luckily we haven't had too many of those. The following day we headed to Trollstigen and descended the very steep and winding roads on the way back home to the cabin. The view from our cabin was tremendous on days with good weather, as it is high above the lake. On days of bad weather, we have found ourselves living above the clouds, sometimes for many days at a time. We have also seen small aircraft flying below us, but we've now got used to this and take it all for granted. If you look across the lake on a good day, you can see a mountain ridge the other side in the distance. This we named the Old Men Mountain, as to us the top of it resembles two old men lying down asleep and quite lifelike, and I can quite see where the mystical trolls came from, although they can be seen better in winter when the trees are heavy with snow. There is also a small valley cut into the hillside opposite, which we call the Cloud Factory. In certain temperatures, new clouds seem to be produced from this small area in large quantities and float up into the sky and generally stay at one level. They are all shapes and sizes. All of a sudden production would stop and you may not see any more for days. One very important cloud produced from here was Cloud 9, where everyone wants to be, of course. And we were lucky enough to have been able to have a picture of it. During the 50 years that we've been involved with Norway, we have seen many changes. Not just the moving of the airport from one side of Oslo to the other, which was good for us, but more recently the E6 up from Oslo has changed out of all recognition. It is no longer a narrow and slow road, as much of it has been made up to dual carriageway, so we can drive a little faster. This appears to be an ongoing project for some years to come. Having been able to observe the progress of this, we have been amazed by what is involved in road making here compared with in England. At home, rarely do road constructors come across rock, but in Norway it seems to be 75% or more of the whole distance. All of this has to be drilled, explosives inserted, and the rock blasted apart before they can even get going. The new tunnel recently constructed between Øya and Tretten, which is 4.5 kilometers long, is a testament to Norwegian engineering. Over the years, we have found that if Norwegians want to get from one place to another, and there is a mountain in the way, they do not go up and over, they just go straight through. There are some very impressive tunnels in western Norway, up to 20 kilometers in length, and one we went through was like a corkscrew, where you started off at the bottom and went round and round in circles until you came out at the top. How this was calculated is beyond me. Near Tretten there is a National Road and Motor Museum at Hunderfossen, where you can see some of the old machinery used in the construction of the roads over the last century. More recent equipment is very large, as you can see if you compare it with the size of Vera standing in front of it. This one would carry 50 tons at a time. Considering ourselves now to be half Norwegian, there was one part of the country that we had never visited. This was of course one of the remotest places on earth, Svalbard. It was a long way from our cabin, but for my 70th birthday I had made up my mind that it was now or never to visit this place, which was only approximately 600 miles from the North Pole. Probably many Norwegians had never been there either, but I was determined to do it before the end. We set off from Woodbury just after midnight on the 17th of March 2012 on a voyage of discovery, flying from London to Tromsø, where we spent the night. The following day we flew on again to Longyearbyen, the capital and only real town on Svalbard. We were blessed with a fine day for our flight and were able to see everything on the way in. We had been talking to a Norwegian lady on the plane who had been there before, and her description of it was, "It is somewhere else." That certainly proved to be true. On landing at Longyearbyen, we were immediately made aware of how remote a place it was and what the dangers were. The "somewhere else" comment by the lady had, however, become very apparent as we approached the islands and could see all the ice jutting out into the sea from the landmass. Of course, what we saw was only a tiny piece of the whole area of Svalbard itself, which is massive and barren like the moon. To want to live there, you need to be a special type of person. Apart from the 1,800 residents, there is a large contingent of scientific people and a university where they only speak English. The town of Longyearbyen is a very basic place compared with other towns in Norway, and everything has to be shipped in for the residents to live there. There are no trees on the islands and no farms to produce food, although the town is well heated by a communal system which pipes hot water to the houses. On day 2, we booked up for a 4-hour guided snow scooter trip out into the more remote valleys, and had to be kitted out in very heavy and stiff thermal suits with thick gloves, boots and helmets. We could hardly walk, but they were very necessary to keep us warm. Eventually, after being given some instructions on how to drive the snow scooter, we set off in convoy and followed our guide, who was equipped with a rifle in case of problems, and we went for about 20 kilometres. 2 old age pensioners from England, having a day out. Wow. You never know who you will meet, of course. On day 3, we had booked for a dog sledding trip in the early evening. We were picked up from our hotel by our guide and placed in the back of her truck for the 10-kilometre journey to the place where we once again had to get kitted out into the now well-known thermal suits, boots and gloves. It was a bit easier this time, as we knew what to do. Then we were taken to the starting point and kennels, where we had to harness up the dogs before starting our journey into the unknown. This was a tremendous experience, and another 20 kilometres was covered. At the end, we were invited to handle the new puppies to help socialise them. Sadly now, our adventure to Svalbard was coming to an end, and the next day we had to return to Oslo via Tromsø. As we arrived late in the evening at Oslo, we stayed there for the night. On the next day we were going to do something we had not done together since OL in 1994. On the way up to Tretton from the airport, we had arranged to stop off at Hamar to see Ragnhild Harnum. We had not seen her together for 18 years. We wondered what she would be like after all this time, as she was now 93 years old. Ragnhild and her husband Anders were, if you remember, the Norwegian family that first contacted us in 1961. She was then about 43. The years have passed for all of us since then, but we are still here. We have always kept in contact at Christmas, but we're looking forward to meeting her again. She has a lovely smile on her face and still lives in the same farm where we first met her. She was really pleased to see us, as we were her. Our memories of the times that we have stayed there will remain with us forever. On the following day we had also arranged to meet someone else who we had not seen for 46 years. This was Berit in the yellow jacket, who was one of the girls who stayed with us in 1966. Now, of course, she had been married for many years and has children and grandchildren of her own. Liv and Berit had always remained good friends since those early days, and we had a good few hours getting up to date with what had happened to all of us during the 46-year gap in our lives. It's interesting to record here that this story now goes full circle, and that the young Norwegian girl on the ferry, Anna-Lena, is still alive and the same age as me. She and her husband Jarle volunteered to check my Norwegian translation so that the book could be published in Norway as well, where it can be found in a certain supermarket chain. Later that year we decided that perhaps we were now getting too old for clambering about on the cabin roof of our little house on the prairie, so reluctantly we decided to sell the cabin. This has since proved to have been a good move, although at the time it was much missed. But was it the right thing to do? As a way of easing out of the situation, we moved back to Magley Camping, where we had started in 1976, and rented one of their cabins for our continued visits for 3 years. This was okay, but the cabins were a bit cramped, having been used to a bit more space, and we had to use the basic utensils supplied. In the end, we had a serious dose of withdrawal symptoms and again took to the internet. We found an old cabin for sale on the other side of the valley, where the red spot is on the map, and decided to take a look at it. This one too was in need of some refurbishment, but was basically in good condition. Part of it was almost 100 years old and had been built of real log cabin construction. The rest had been added later. The main bonus was that it was on the sunny side of the valley, whereas Lyckerbo had been on the shady side and only had access to the sun for a short time each day because of the height of the mountain behind. This was something we had not realized when we bought it. This new cabin could get the sun from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night during the summer. However, it did have one major problem from our point of view, and that could be seen here. The potentially lovely view was totally obscured. That put us off a bit, but after some serious negotiations, helped by the fact that the owner was desperate to sell it, we decided to take another chance. Perhaps there was a way round this problem of the trees. In the winter it was not so bad, as the leaves had gone from the trees and you could sort of see through, but it was not ideal. However, as if by magic, when we returned on a later visit, all the trees had gone, and we now had a fantastic panoramic view. This obviously would enhance any future sale potential. We have loved our time in Norway, but it is not for the faint-hearted. Last winter the snow in this area was almost 4 feet deep and up to Vera's elbow. On higher ground, up in the Setters, it could be up to 8 feet deep, and this snow would be not cleared at all during the winter. Unless you have got some friendly neighbours, it could be a problem to get to your front door. The snow depth into our cabin was over 3 feet deep on this occasion, but with the right gear, it does help. The thermometer outside our cabin registered -26 one night last February, which is a little chilly, but summer temperatures have been recorded at 30 plus. Unscheduled visitors are not uncommon and have to be taken for granted. We do miss being able to look down on the lake as we could in our old cabin, but this is perhaps balanced out by some super sunsets here at times. It's not easy to try to put the whole of 55 years into 30 or 60 minutes, and there is an awful lot that's had to be left out, but I hope you have been able to get the gist of what has gone on. It has been, and still is, a major family adventure, which hopefully will go on for a bit longer, God willing. You may think that it has been an expensive exercise, but it has been self-financing. All the costs will have been recouped on the sale of the properties. The first one did exceptionally well, and we will have come out of it with money to put back into the bank to pay for our potential nursing home fees in the future. Our Norwegian friends have often said to us, why did we pick Tretton? The word Tretton, to those who are not aware, is a Norwegian word for 13. 13 is not classed as a lucky number in England, but we also have a saying here which is 13, lucky for some. No need to say any more, really. So I will finish with a bit of traditional dance music from the Tretton dancing group musicians.